Hi everyone. So, not made any videos for a while, and that's largely because the sort of rich seam of tutorial videos, we kind of got to the end of that. So I thought I would try something a bit different this time, which is just do a sort of spotlight, not dissimilar to what Fred did with the Centauri, but for one of the minor factions in the game, the Descari Committees. Now, you might be wondering, I was like, well, why are you making a video over quite a relatively small faction? And I guess there's two main reasons. One is I think, Earth Force, Centauri, Narn, Minbari, everyone's reasonably familiar with those factions from the show and because they're some of the major factions. Uh, Less of a spotlight then on the sort of smaller factions such as the Descari, which were, like so many of the smaller factions in Babylon 5 Wars, completely created for the game and at best only referenced in passing in the television show or source materials. And the other reason is that Descari are one of the more recent additions to the Fiery Void browser version of Babylon 5 Wars. So it seemed like a good time, as a person who kind of added them to the game, just to go through their different ships, give my thoughts on their sort of relative power to the other factions, and just kind of highlight some stuff that now that I've played a few games with them, that I think is quite interesting. So that's what we're going to do in this video, and you'll see that I've got the full Descari Navy lined up there before us, and thematically they're taking on a small Dilgar force, but we won't worry about the Dilgar too much at this point in time, which is probably words never said by anyone within the Babylon 5 universe. Okay, well, where to start? I mean, I guess brief sort of backstory to the Descari. As a faction, they were added to Babylon 5 Wars in the Showdowns 4 expansion booklet. And essentially, this Showdowns were focused on the Dilgar invasion conflict, and then added the Descari as one of the races who described as a xenophobic race of large ape-like creatures. So they're not the most friendly, and they encountered the Narn earlier on, and then unfortunately for them, they were in the way of the Dilgar advance, and then so they got pretty conquered pretty quickly by the Dilgar. Their technology just wasn't up to putting up much of a fight. And then, so the backstory from that, the sort of resistance against the Dilgar, I think, was sort of decentralized committee structure, and hence the name, the Descari Committees. So, what we get from that is this is a faction that's not particularly high tech. They, I think, only really had their own sort of solar system at the point where the Dilgar struck. So the lower end of the galactic powers in themselves. That doesn't mean their ships are not interesting. And after Showdowns 4, there was another Showdown 6, I think, which added quite a few more modern Descari ships, and so it told the story of after the Dilgar invasions, the Descari actually recover reasonably quickly, start getting a bit full of themselves, and like many of the other galactic powers, found themselves in a war against the game intelligence, the insectoid race, which we have in Babylon 5 Wars, but we don't yet have in Fiery Void. From memory, that conflict was a stalemate, but the Descari kind of had to be a bit humble pie when the game counterattacked. That's the backstory here. That's what you've got. Let's start looking at the ships. So I started at the. I've got the capital ships up the top here. I've got the kind of heavy combat ships here, and then the sort of lighter vessels and base down there. So I think the best place to start is probably with, I think I'm right in saying the Descari's most modern warship, which is the Scoran new heavy cruiser. So a couple of things about the Scoran from the get-go is it is armed with the Descari's signature weapon, which is the Plasma Bolter, and this has the largest version of that, the Heavy Plasma Bolter. So it's a bit of a combination of your typical plasma weapons and sort of bolter weapons. I think the lore for this weapon is that essentially propels the plasma in such a way that it doesn't decay for a certain period of time or distance, after which it starts to decay. So we can see this represented in the rules. Most plasma weapons start to lose damage from the instant they're firing. So like a heavy plasma gun, for example. Let's see if I can find another plasma gun. So here we go. A medium plasma cannon does less damage over distance, at a point of 1 point of damage per 2 hexes, or half a point of damage per hex. The plasma bolter doesn't do that up to a certain range, and for the heavy plasma bolter that range is 15 hexes. So for the first 15 hexes you're still going to do the set damage of 22, and that's kind of where the bolter elements come in, where it always does a set amount of damage, 22, but it does ignore half of armor like a plasma weapon. So really, unlike most plasma weapons are short range, medium range at best. This one actually, though, has a range penalty the same as a long range weapon, 1.65 per hex. So to give a comparison, that's the same range penalty as a heavy laser, for example, on the Narn. So it should be able to hit from quite, I mean, strictly speaking, straight across the map. Your hit chance probably wouldn't be that bad, and the fire control, 10 for heavy combat medium cells, 15 for large vessels. That's not too bad either. So you could hit, but how much damage would you lose? Because after 15 hexes, the damage starts to decay, and you can see it's 1 point per 3 hexes. So actually that's not too bad either, when you think about it. I mean, most plasma weapons would be 1 per 2 hex, or even 1 per hex. 1 per 3 hex isn't too bad, but at 22 damage, it's not doing as much damage as, say, a heavy plasma cannon. So really, really strange weapon. And when I've been sort of playing games with this, I think most people I've seen hold off. Like, they try and fire it within the 15 hexes to get most damage. But I'm starting to wonder if, 3-turn recharge, it might not be worth punting a couple of these off early doors. So let's see. If this Scorn Heavy Cruiser fired at the Dreadnought, let's assume it hits. It's 41 hexes away. How much damage would that do? So first 15, no damage penalty. So that would be 26. 26 divided by 3 is 9. So you would do 22 minus 9 damage, which is 13 damage, half armor. So if hit the front, you do 11 damage. You could take out a weapon quite safely. You could do a bit of damage to the hull. You could you could take out a thruster. So it's not great, but it's not the worst idea in the world. And that's turn 1. When people play these, and when I've played them in, we have people waiting to close for a couple of turns. So turn 3, turn 4 before you even fire them. If you're going to wait to turn 4 anyway, then there's an argument just for popping that off in turn 1, see what you get. So interesting hybrid weapon, and you get, and we'll see them on the other ships, medium and light versions of it as well. So, but I find the heaviest one the most curious, or hardest to pin down where to use it. Looking at the rest of the Scorn kit, it's so good arcs on those plasma bolters, good forward arcs. Then has 4 medium lasers, but this maybe isn't as strong as it looks at first glance, because if you look at the arcs, decent side arcs, but these two at the side, they're actually more rearward facing. So if you can get a sort of broadside face one of your flanks as you get closer, because medium lasers, I would say a medium ranged weapon. So you fire off your plasma bolters, you get a bit closer. If you could make it so your side's presented to the enemy, then these two do overlap. Get a bit closer to show that. So you could potentially fire one broadside, try and turn and fire another broadside. In terms of maneuverability, it's, turn cost 1, turn delay 1. It's not as sprightly as a Centauri Primus or an Arn Jaquan. 10 thrust, doesn't have as much thrust either. And this, you just have to accept as a faction the sort of lower down in the technology chain. So they're okay, but you probably have to plan a bit ahead, and you're probably not going to win any maneuverability contests against a more modern, more powerful faction. And then sort of to finish the ship off, you have quite a lot of light particle beams. These ones all in kind of 180 degrees, so 3 either side, a couple forward facing, and then at the back you have light plasma bolters. So decent kind of arcs in all of them. Light particle beams obviously okay at best. Range apparently 10 per hex. It's not going to do as much damage or at much range as a standard particle beam, but again, in the sort of lower end of the technology tree, this is kind of what you expect. So pretty solid ship. It carries 12 fighters as well. And one of the reasons you probably find that you'll always end up taking this ship if you play in tournament rules is it's the only Descari ship with a jump engine. So very typical to see the Descari fleet built around the scoring. Okay, moving on, we have this is actually a larger ship than the Scoran, but it's slightly older. The Scorota battleship. Scorota, yeah. It's a bit of a monstrosity. You'll see the Descari had contact with the Narn, and you'll see that actually quite a lot of their ships are sort of basically recolored versions of that's the Rongoth there, and that's the Taloth. The Scorota battleship is essentially, they started with a Taloth, and then they added an extra, a third wing piece on top of it to get this very heavily armed battleship. So you've got 4 of those heavy plasma bolters we were talking about earlier. You've got 4 medium lasers, all with forward firing arcs. You've got a couple of missiles tacked on there, and then you've got 7 light particle beams for your sort of short range firepower. So that is a lot of weaponry for a ship, that's not that expensive. So you're like, well what's the catch? Part of the catch is that you don't get very many sensors for that. You get 18 thrust, which is basically 6 for every wing side. But the thing maneuvers like a lead elephant. I mean, look at that. It's going at speed 5, typical cruising speed. Your turn cost is 8. Your turn delay is 8. And your thrusters, they're not super good. So you're not going to get that turn delay down all that much. So I've played this ship once. I think it cost around 900 points kind of region, and I got a volley off. I did some pretty good damage to it, and then it spent the rest of the game it got its front shut off. I think was part of the problem, so I couldn't slow down. I was stuck at speed 5, and I was just lumbering around until such a time as the enemy destroyed me. So, does it have a place in your fleet? Yeah, probably. Doesn't carry any fighters, which is something to bear in mind. But I think it probably needs a lot of support, and it's probably one of those ships that, with that kind of turn delay and that kind of turn cost, you're going to have to maneuver very slowly, so it's not going to be winning many initiative battles. Okay, so moving on to the next batch of ships. And I say batch because you have the Scorava cruiser. One of the frustrating things about the Descari is all their ships have very similar names. So I'll try and pronounce them correctly, but if not, hopefully you can read the tooltips for yourself. So the Scorava cruiser, one of the older Descari cruisers. It is, as you can see, completely based on the Narn Taloth hull, recolored in Descari colours, but the weaponry is different, and not as heavy as the Taloth. So if you look, you can see where the Taloth is heavy plasma cannons, 2 per side, and the same sort of narrow arcs that you can see there. The Scorava only has medium plasma cannons. I think the Taloth is light pulse cannons. We've got light particle beams here, probably not as strong. Although we do have a couple of light plasma cannons at the back and front, which you won't see in the Taloth. But overall, this means the Scorava is much shorter range than Taloth. It's, I think, reasonably maneuverable. Its turn cost is only 2/3. turn delay is a bit more. It's got 12 thrust, same as the Sloth, so it can get around. Its sensors aren't quite as good, it's only sensors of 6, but it does carry 24 fighters, which is quite helpful. So it's as a carrier, I would say it's okay, um, the earlier version. But what you also have available in the Descari is the more sort of modern, refitted version of the Scarava. And here the differences are: we tacked on a couple of Class S missiles, so range of 20, but decent damage on them. The plasma cannons have been replaced with plasma bolters, so you've got light plasma bolters at the front, mediums at the side. Well, only one in this case. The other medium being replaced with a missile, which I think is a reasonably good trade, to be honest. Gives you a bit of range that you didn't have before. And in terms of the medium and light plasma bolters, we remember the heavy one didn't take any sort of range damage penalty up to 15 hexes, while the medium that's 10 hexes, and for the light one it's 5. So really sort of fulfilling the roles of far more medium range weapon, far more sort of short ranged weapon, and you'll see that the damage reduction penalty is a bit more severe for the lighter versions of the plasma bolters. So it's 1 point of damage per 2 hexes on the medium plasma bolter, and 1 point of damage per hex on the light plasma bolter. But still has the same advantages of the heavier one. So set damage 10 in the case of light plasma bolter, and ignores half of armor. So up close, these can do some pretty reasonable damage, and as per usual, just the sort of light particle beam. So when choosing a Descari fleet, I find that yes, the older version's a bit cheaper, but I mean, if you've got the points, I generally feel that you're going to get more value out of the refitted version if you need a carrier for the Descari, who worth taking, I would say. I mean, the Descari fighter choices, and we'll get them later, are reasonably good. So yeah, decent ship, the refitted version. Okay, kind of low tech, cheaper choice for the Scarava, but I mean they're solid enough. And the other variant for the Scarava is a laser cruiser. So in this case, all the plasma cannons have been stripped out and replaced with lasers and/or short-range missiles. So you've got only medium lasers though, so you're not getting that sort of long-range punch. And the sort of lighter ones are replaced with light lasers, which, pretty short-ranged as well. Damage isn't great on them, but they are laser-based weapons, so they can't be intercepted. Is it worth it? Maybe. I haven't really used this ship yet. I think my preference is probably with the refitted version. But I don't think it's a bad choice for a carrier in a fleet if you really want to bring quite a lot of fighters to it. And the missiles, like I say, are always good. Okay, so that's the Descari capital ship choice. You can see, right, I mean, I think the Scorin's a pretty solid basis for fleet, and then these are good, decent carrier choices. The next thing to sort of look at is the heavy combat vessels. So first up is the Rulnar heavy destroyer. So like the Scorin, it's, I think, reasonably modern ship from memory and was in Showdown 6. And that's sort of, generally speaking, when you say modern for Descari, that means it's fitted with plasma bolters, and so it starts getting built after the Dilgar War. So in this case, we've got 2. The arcs mean that you can only fire both at the same target if they're directly ahead of you, but okay. And 2 medium lasers. We've got 6 light particle beams with reasonable arcs, and then a couple of light plasma bolters at the back. So pretty well armed. Quite a lot of hull up front, maybe not so much in primary. Those look at it, and this is based on the lore in the source material, is the ship is heavily based on the Earth Artemis ship, so the design for it there is slightly elongated and recolored. But yeah, if you know what the Artemis looks like, you kind of know what you're getting with this, albeit with a completely different weapons loadout. Solid ship. I've got a game ongoing where I'm going to take 3 of them, see if they can sort of punch at or above their weight. But I like that you've got quite a lot of weapons up front here. could do a lot of damage. And I like that it's reasonably maneuverable in terms of turn cost and turn delay, but only thrust of 8. So that at the moment is something I'm wary of. Acceleration cost of 2 though, that's pretty good. So yet to be seen whether it's too flighty. One thing I've already noticed is, with the engine got an efficiency of 3, I could turn off all my rear weapons, get 6 power, so I could have 10 thrust in the engine. Equally, I could turn off the back there, and a light particle beam boost my scanners to 7. So, you know, can easily boost some of these things that are a bit lacking naturally, just uh, particularly in the early part of the game, just by through power management. So yeah, I'm hoping for good things from the Rilnata. Next up, we have the Rilnata. So this is Descari's only E-lint vessel. It's not a particularly great E-lint vessel. It's as you see, it's got very sort of in many of like the lower tech races, they actually have separate E-lint scanners because they can't build a good enough one centrally. So you got a pair of two value E-lint scanners up front and 4 in the middle. So you've got 8 sensors in total, which for an E-lint vessel is pretty poor. Even if you turned all your light particle beams off, you can boost that to 5. Great, you've got 9 scanners. That's still not massively good. I suppose from an E-lint point of view, you do have 2 missiles here with really good firing arcs here. I mean, like that's what 240-degree firing arcs, so that's great in the sense that most E-lint vessels don't maybe contribute major firepower at medium or long ranges, but at 20 hexes or less, yeah, a couple of missiles every turn, that's all right. But in terms of E-lint functions, it's not particularly good. I'm not sure it would be my first choice for fleet battles around the sort of standard 3,500 points. Saying that though, as an E-lint vessel, it's got the 33% cap on how much you can spend on that type of vessel. The Rilnata is so cheap. It's 450 points. I think you could actually get 2 of these in a standard tournament game, which may not be wise, but it is kind of interesting because I can't think of any other race which has an E-lint vessel that essentially you could take 2 at that points range. As I say, it's interesting. I think your points are probably better spent somewhere else, if I'm being honest. But maybe there's some possibilities there. Maybe someone wants to try that out. I don't know. Sticking with heavy combat vessels, we next have kind of like really sort of older standard, again based on Narn Hull, the Rolpa. Rolpa, this is the type of ship you would see supporting the original Scarava. It's got really actually quite a ton of light weaponry. I mean, up close it really has quite a lot. Medium plasma cannons, light plasma cannons. So this thing's not really doing anything at range, but up close it's got a bit of potential. Quite a lot of thrust, nice energy efficiency, fairly maneuverable. Turn cost 2/3, turn delay half. If you can get up close to the enemy, you can do a bit of damage to this. It's also like a reasonably good escort ship for the Descari, and reasonably cheap. So yeah, I wouldn't dismiss it, but it does, like the Scarava, have a more modern version, which is the Rilpasa. This thing has 10 light particle beams with pretty good arcs there, and has 2 medium plasma bolters, giving it a bit more range, albeit might be losing a bit more overall damage potential. If the Ropa got up close and unloaded with everything, you might find it do a bit more damage. But the Ropasa, I think, is a far more versatile ship, and probably one I would favour. Has a little bit less engine, has a little bit of thrust though, so that's quite interesting. Although you could turn some of these light particle beams off, boost that up a couple on the approach. And then the third variant, or second variant, but third version of the Rulpa hull, or Brungot hull, is probably one of the Descari's better ships, actually, the Rothar Missile Destroyer. So, bit like the Ronata, it's got, in this case, 4 missiles, quite generous arcs again. So these two are maybe exclusive, but these two at the sides with 240 arcs. So you're probably firing at least 3, maybe 4 missiles from this thing once it gets in range every couple of turns. Reasonably stocked with light particle beams, although not too many up front, so that's quite interesting. And again, very cheap. So like the Rolonata, this is a missile ship, so fits within the 33% restriction bracket. But in a 3,500 game, I think again this is around 450 points. You could take 2 of these. So to have 2 missile-based ships at that points value, 3,500, is unusual and quite interesting. So, you know, a fleet based around 2 of these, a capital ship, and maybe some of the light support vessels. That's, you know, got potential to do quite a lot of damage, be quite difficult to handle. So, yeah, one of the more interesting things about Descari is that their specialist ships are really cheap, frankly, and that gives you options you wouldn't get with other races. Um, Moving on to their medium vessels then. Okay, so again, start with a more sort of modern version. This is Cava escort frigate, absolutely loaded with light particle beams. So very short range, but absolute ton of them. And you've got 3 either side there. So front and back arcs. If you're dead on, you could hit with 6 of these. Yeah, a couple of light plasma bolters up front and a medium plasma bolter up front as well. So very heavily armed. Armor's not great. Not that much hull, frankly. 5 sensors is not great in galactic terms relative to its peers, but you know, reasonable considering heavy combat vessels only have about 6. Engine is okay, particularly since the turn cost is only a third and turn delay is half. So yeah, it's okay. Not an agile ship like a lot of medium ships for the other races, the other factions, and indeed the Descari don't have an agile ship, but it's still reasonably maneuverable and pretty heavily armed, especially up close for a medium ship. Good escort frigate. The next, the sort of older medium vessel is the Cross-Coutu. I have no idea. And this is the sort of one that would sit alongside the Ropa and Scrav in the fleet, and it's all right, frankly. It's, you know, quite maneuverable, but it only has 4 thrust, so your turn cost and your turn delay very low. Great. I mean, at speed 5, it's 3 each, so you can turn once unless you either boost your engines. With an efficiency of 2 is not a bad option. I mean, you can turn these plasma torches. Plasma torches are very interesting weapons. Yes, they can kind of overheat, but they can do quite a lot of damage up close. You just do have to get very close, and without the sort of thrust, frankly, to sort of maneuver that close, you're kind of taking your chances. Armor of 3. I mean, this thing's flimsy. What I will say about it is, you know, these 3 plasma weapons, if you can maneuver it right, if you can win an initiative, I don't know, and get up close, you could potentially do a lot of damage. I'm not convinced it's going to be that easy, because I think, you know, with that scanners and that armor, someone sees you coming, then they have a reasonable chance of blowing you away. Light particle beams have 360-degree arc, so again, I guess for escort purposes or just kind of keeping some steady fire up close, could be quite useful. Yeah. But that's the older version. Like there's actually an even earlier version of this, which just is 3 plasma torches. So everything I said about the standard version applies to this, except it's a little bit more worse. It also has light particle bolts, which is a new weapon I had to create because we didn't have any this lowest of tech of particle beams. But essentially, they're a worse version of the light particle beam. So less damage. I think the fire controls, the fire controls considerably worse as well. So not very good at all, frankly. Incredibly cheap though, and that's to be said for all the cross-Goto, for medium ships, and remember they're not agile either. So these are really cheap options to fill out some points. Gives you an extra vessel, whereas other races you might have to take a sort of fighter wing. That's when you actually get a ship. Is that better? Is that worse? I suppose depends on your fleet doctrine, what you're going for. So early version, normal standard version, and then you have a refitted version, like the other ships. Still has the light particle beams on 360, fine. Gets a bit more sensors though, gets an extra thrust, might give you options, and then gets light plasma bolters and medium plasma bolters, so a bit more firepower, I guess, medium range. So this one's again probably the one I would take. I think it's probably easier to use, easier to get value out of, but possibly someone's got a valid tactic where they just swarm with and get up close with the earlier versions. Okay, so that's the ships. I think just sort of sticking next, we'll do the fighters, and then the sort of scenario PCs. So there's probably a bit less in them, but the fighters, the Descari medium fighter is the Noscor. It is based on the Gorith Narn fighter, so this is the original Descari fighter. 10 health, 9 thrust. Not great. Armor's not super good either. Actually better from the side than it is from the front and rear. And has a light plasma gun, so I think this is a Rogalon weapon actually. But it can do a lot of damage if you can get up close. So where these fighters shine, I think they're alright interceptors if you get in the same hex. They'll do a lot of damage. They hit offensive bonus only 15, so not as good at range as some fighters. 25 is maybe your sort of standard value there for the major powers fighters. But the damage 6 to 8 is very consistent, and as a plasma weapon ignores half of armor. So if you can find a blind spot on a ship's side, swoop in, you can do an absolute ton of damage with these guys, but they will be vulnerable to getting intercepted themselves, and they will be vulnerable to ships' anti-fighter weaponry if they're in arc. So, alright actually, pretty decent, high damage potential. The Nos Cha, which is the more modern heavy fighter, that's a bit more interesting actually, because they have a plasma bolter version gun. So this does, like the other plasma bolters, a set damage of 7. It's plasma weapon, so it ignores half of armor, but like other plasma bolter weapons, it doesn't degrade. And I should point out the sort of light plasma gun that does degrade one damage per hex, which is why I say you really have to get in close to do good damage. This doesn't for 3 hexes, so the Nostra can park themselves 3 hexes away from a ship and not lose any of their damage potential, which clearly really increases their survivability. They've got a bit more armor in the front, they've got a bit more thrust, a bit more health. So they can, do pretty good damage themselves at a bit of a sort of safer range. So they're quite interesting. They're not cheap, I'll say that, but they are, I think, a good heavy fighter for a small faction to have. They can only be taken by certain ships, unfortunately. So the Scoran, as a modern ship, that can take them, and I think there's probably only one other ship. Is it the Nazcor? Yeah, it's got a secondary hangar. There it is, where it can take 6 of the new Nostra heavy fighters. But that will be marked on the fleet selection. It will say whether it can take fighters or heavy fighters, and that's how, or medium or heavy fighters, and that's how you know. Okay, so let's just sort of finish off with the Descari scenario PCs. Some of them are kind of interesting. We've got LCVs. There's no LCV carrier, so this is really on the scenarios where you're defending the Descari home system, or if your opponent's just pretty chill and happy for you to use them. There's a earlier version of it, which has a medium plasma gun, 3 light particle beams, fair enough, as gunboats go. And then there's a more modern version, which has medium plasma bolter. Again, that might actually hurt someone from medium range, so a couple of light plasma bolters. I think that's kind of solid. It would be quite interesting to play it. It's all the usual drawbacks of light combat vehicles, where you can only use half of your scanners defensively. But it could be interesting to play with. In terms of orbital satellites, you've got two, an older and a newer one. Starting with the older one, actually has another unique, maybe not unique weapon, but a new weapon that had to be added for this guy, which is his dual plasma cannon. So this is, the gravitic lance was the sort of weapon I was thinking about when I made this. Essentially, it can fire as a dual plasma cannon, which is a very uh, powerful single shot of plasma. So you're doing like 13 to 58 damage. Range penalties only 2.5 per hex, which is really good for a plasma weapon, albeit you do lose 1 point of damage every 2 hexes. So you can do that, or you can fire it as two medium plasma cannons, which would have the sort of the usual stats of a medium plasma cannon. So it's one of those weapons you can fire either way. In either case, it's 3 turns recharge. It's I don't know. I mean, I guess if someone got too close and got caught unawares, the single shot could absolutely wreck someone. But it's a orbital satellite scenario thing, so I don't expect to see it get much play. But it is interesting that that weapon exists. Then you have a more modern version of a medium plasma bolter and two missiles. I mean that's a pretty solid orbital satellite if you ask me. The missiles where they come in, a couple of lighter weapons, and then medium plasma, medium range. For 200 points ish, something like that. That's all right. And then finally, the Descari have a small base called the Karana. It's I think only 700 points, so it's really on the sort of smaller side. It's not one of these gigantic star bases. Only has 3 sides, um, which again was no. I think we had that with the Chilonis, but that means it's got a lot less hull overall rather than a 4-sided or 5 or 6-sided base. So it's not going to be able to take as much damage. Weapon loadout, 3 light guns, 2 missiles, and 1 heavy plasma bolt on either side. So it's okay if you wanted to run a base assault against Descari. I suppose one of the good things is that that would not be an overbearing piece to have. It's likely to be quite strong because the missiles would have a longer range, but it's probably not going to dominate the battlefield in the way that some bases can. Like the sort of big sort of 2,000, 2,500 point bases tend to just kind of take over the game, frankly. It's not going to do that. It's more of a kind of outpost style thing. So yeah, you can maybe work up some good scenario battles with them. And yeah, that's it. So hopefully that was a useful kind of run through of who the Descari are, what their ships look like, and kind of giving some thoughts. In terms of fleet selection, I find myself starting with a Scoran. If I'm going to go fighter heavy, I'll take one of these, probably the refitted Scorava, um, and then a couple of maybe the Ropassa or the Rothar can do that. I do like the Kriskava, I do like to have that in there. And then if I've got any spare points, fill that out with fighters or maybe one of the refitted Kraskuta. The other fleet I'm trying at the moment is just based on sort of scoring and taking 3 Rulners, just as sort of good solid ships, a couple of fighters, um, and then the Missile Destroyer. I mean, it really is a great little ship, that one. So if you can take it for 450 points, I'd always try and squeeze it in. So yeah, and we'll see how that one goes. But hopefully some of you have already tried Descari. If you're still listening, thank you very much for my sort of indulgent chat through the race that I added. And yeah, have fun playing. Catch you later.